All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking what is honestly one of the most fascinating and frankly staggering wealth transfers in modern entertainment history. You see, the 1990s gave us the CD boom, some of the absolute biggest selling albums of all time, and unprecedented corporate profits. But right beneath the glittering surface of the MTV era, the financial architecture of the music business was quietly trapping superstars in a totally rigged system. We're going to break down the exact mechanics of how labels turned global icons into what were essentially sharecroppers, and how the battles fought back then created the multi-billion-dollar music landscape we're living in today. Let's dive in.
To really grasp the stakes here, we've got to start with this incredibly powerful warning from Prince. He famously wrote the word slave on his cheek in 1993. And, at the time, a lot of people in the industry just laughed it off. They thought it was just an eccentric publicity stunt. But Prince was pointing to a very real, very binding legal reality. The standard 90s record deal wasn't just a tough negotiation, it was a highly efficient wealth extraction machine. And the sheer scale of that wealth, it was mind-blowing. Throughout the 90s, the global recorded music industry generated roughly $40 billion in revenue. That's $40 billion with a B. Consumers were rapidly replacing their old vinyl and cassette collections with brand new CDs. It was an absolute gold rush. And yet, the creators, the actual people writing, singing, and performing the music that generated those billions, were often struggling just to pay their rent. It sounds impossible, right? Well, here's how they did it.
Part 1. The Trap. The financial architecture of the standard deal.
Let's just look at the actual math of the CD boom for a second. A brand new CD in the 90s cost a consumer around $15.99. Now, the manufacturing cost for that little piece of plastic? Only about $1. That left an enormous, frankly incredible profit margin. But the artist was only allocated a royalty rate of maybe 10 to 12% of the wholesale price. So out of a $16 CD, the artist's share amounted to roughly $1.12 to $1.92. But wait, because it actually gets worse. The artist didn't even see that dollar. Before the artist saw a single cent of that tiny cut, the labels took out an absurd list of deductions. They called these recoupable expenses. Sure, the label fronted the money for studio time, the session musicians, and those massive cinematic 90s music videos that routinely cost between $500,000 and $1 million. But all of that was deducted straight from the artist's royalty slice. And the labels even deducted 20 to 25% for packaging. And incredibly, they kept a breakage allowance, which was this completely outdated deduction meant to cover broken vinyl records being shipped on bumpy trucks. That made literally 0 cents for CDs. So by the time these expenses were recouped, artists were making pennies on the dollar, turning their massive upfront advances into pure crushing debt. So here's the absolute kicker, the ownership trap. Let's say an artist magically paid off all that debt. They still didn't own the music. Standard 90s contracts included what's called a work-for-hire clause. This meant the label owned the master recordings in perpetuity, forever. The artist had no more legal claim to their legendary, culture-defining albums than a corporate employee has to a spreadsheet they threw together on a Tuesday. The label captured all the long-term appreciation and value. We're talking reissues, TV licensing, and eventually the entire streaming boom. Moving on to part 2, the casualties, superstars living as sharecroppers. The contrast here between massive commercial dominance and shocking financial ruin is just stark. Think about TLC. They sold 14 million copies of Crazy Sexy Cool, yet they received only 56 cents per album, and that was split 3 ways. The recouped expenses were so astronomically high, they famously had to file for bankruptcy right at the absolute peak of their fame. Or look at Tupac Shakur. He generated $60 million in album sales in 1996 alone, yet died with only $200,000 to his name and $4.9 million in debt to Death Row Records. And then you have Alanis Morissette, who moved 33 million copies of Jagged Little Pill, while her business manager systematically skimmed $5 million from her earnings. And this trap extended right into the massive teen pop explosion, too. NSYNC generated over $1 billion in revenue. $1 billion. But they were locked into contracts structured by their manager, Lou Pearlman, that were so incredibly exploitative, the group basically had to sue for fraud just to win their freedom. Pearlman eventually went to federal prison, but the underlying point here is that this trap existed across every single genre in the industry. The standard deal was the standard deal, and for most artists, there was simply nowhere else to go. Which leads us to part 3, the rebellions. Artists fight professional slavery. This brings us to a really landmark legal battle. In 1992, George Michael actually sued Sony.
claiming his contract essentially amounted to professional slavery. See, after the massive global success of his album Faith, Michael wanted to downplay his sex symbol image for his follow-up album. He refused to put his face on the cover, refused to appear in the music videos, and in response, he alleged that Sony basically refused to promote the album. Michael took them to court, arguing the contract was completely one-sided. He was legally bound to produce music and give up the copyright, but the label had zero reciprocal legal obligation to actually market his work. But in 1994, the High Court in the UK delivered its verdict. And, unfortunately for the artists, the court wholly rejected George Michael's claims. The judge ruled that because Michael had expert legal advice when he signed and because the terms were comparable to industry standards for a superstar, the contract was completely enforceable. The labels won. The courts effectively validated the 90s standard deal as perfectly legal business. So, effectively blocked by the courts, artists had to get creative. Prince took a deeply symbolic, radical path against Warner Bros. Because the label actually owned the trademark to the name Prince, he literally changed his name to an unpronounceable symbol in 1993 just to separate his new work from their catalog. He hacked the system by aggressively releasing a flood of music just to burn through his contractual obligations, which culminated in his 1996 album, aptly titled Emancipation. He was also innovating direct-to-fan internet sales way before it was cool. It took a relentless, decades-long fight, but in 2014, he finally regained control of his master recordings. All right, Part 4, The Power Brokers, Weaponizing Leverage. Back in 1991, Q-Tip from A Tribe Called Quest famously rapped, "Industry rule number 4080, record company people are shady." And he hit the nail right on the head. The 90s effectively created two completely different classes of artists. On one side, the majority. Artists who trusted the system, provided the raw material for corporate billions, and ended up financially drained. On the other side, artists like Madonna, Jay-Z, and Dr. Dre, who figured out early on that ownership was everything. They hired fierce negotiators and built their own massive financial empires. One of the most prominent of these power brokers was entertainment lawyer Alan Grubman. Grubman used a highly aggressive and honestly pretty controversial strategy called cross-representation. He represented top superstar talent, sure, but his firm simultaneously kept major record labels on retainer. Now, critics and ethicists were quick to point out the glaring conflicts of interest here, like when Billy Joel sued him for $90 million over divided loyalties. But Grubman's proponents argued this dual role was a superpower. It gave him unparalleled insider leverage. He knew exactly what the labels could afford, and he weaponized that knowledge to secure historic deals for his clients. Let's look at how this leverage built actual generational wealth. In 1992, Madonna signed a staggering $60 million joint venture with Time Warner. Now, this wasn't just an advance, it created a brand new multimedia company called Maverick, making Madonna the CEO. She secured a 20% royalty rate and unprecedented control over her music, her publishing, and her film projects. She completely flipped the script. She wasn't just an employee anymore, she was a partner. Another legendary power broker, lawyer John Branca, really showcased the sheer exponential power of ownership during his work with Michael Jackson. Branca helped Jackson buy the ATV music publishing catalog, which, by the way, included the rights to the Beatles songs, for $47.5 million back in 1985. Through strategic mergers with Sony over the decades, the Jackson estate eventually sold their share to Sony in 2016 for $750 million. That is a return on investment of over 2,000%. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that in the music business, publishing and master ownership are the ultimate assets. Part 5. The Aftershock. The Legacy of Master Ownership Today. The massive catalog acquisition boom we see in the headlines literally right now, it exists primarily because of the immense value locked inside those exact 90s contracts. When Wall Street companies like Primary Wave and Hypnosis spend billions buying up rates, or when Bruce Springsteen sells his catalog to Sony for roughly $550 million, they're trading on assets defined by this specific era. And when artists like Taylor Swift painstakingly re-record their entire catalogs to circumvent the master recordings they don't own, they are fighting the exact same legal architecture that Prince went to war over 30 years ago. The original artists rarely benefited fully from the cultural value they created, but that value is now trading for billions. So what is the big takeaway from this explainer? Ultimately, it's a critical lesson in intellectual property. Whether you are a musician, an everyday creator, or really just someone interested in how wealth is generated and transferred in our society, the 90s record deal is a masterclass in the quiet mechanics of extraction. Through information asymmetry, confusing recoupment lists, and standard work for hire clauses, the industry systematically transferred generational wealth from the creators of culture directly to the holders of capital. Which leaves us with this final thought to chew on. The vicious battles of the 90s were fought over pieces of plastic and master tapes. Today, music is distributed through algorithmic streaming platforms that control playlist placement and hoard user data. So as artists finally start to win the war for their master recordings, have the tech platforms simply created a brand new trap? Who truly owns the listener today? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I'll catch you next time.